Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. It's very nice to see almost a full room, and I hope you are enjoying your candlelights on the table. I was tempted to start dimming the lights, but I think we have to keep it on. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the start of an exciting series, and we named the series the Emerging Researcher Spotlight Series. Welcome to you here in the room, and I would also like to welcome everyone online. If you would like to let us know where you're joining us from, which faculty or department, feel free to put it in the chat. So my name is Annemieke Vernost, and I'm the Associate Vice President Research here at the University of Manitoba. So I would like to begin by recognizing that the University of Manitoba campuses are located on the original lands of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Red River Métis Nation. As a member of the University of Manitoba research community, I'm very proud to be part of collaborative partnerships with First Nations communities and striving for reconciliation. The Emerging Researcher Spotlight Series was created to shine spotlight on researchers that are in their first decade here of their career at the University of Manitoba. And we're going to feature 6 events. This is the first one. We will have 3 at Fort Garry campus and 3 at the Bannatyne campus. And we hope that each event will provide an opportunity to learn about the impactful research that is taking place here at the University of Manitoba, but we also like to use it as a network event, and we actually are hoping that the emerging researchers will be mingling and perhaps dream up some future projects that they can work on together. So today we will be hearing from 8 researchers, and these 8 researchers are from a wide range of units. They are from the Asper School of Business, the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences, the Faculty of Architecture, the Faculty of Law, the Faculty of Social Work, and the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences. And in preparation of this, we asked each of the researchers to give us up to 5 keywords about the work that they're engaged in, and this is the result. So this gives you a little bit of a flavor what you will be hearing today in the room. So I would like to inform you a little bit about the logistics of how this is going to work. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers and we'll tell a little bit about where they are from, what their specific keywords are, and then the speaker will be presenting for 5 minutes, and then we'll move off the stage while I'm introducing the next speaker, and the next speaker will come on the stage. And so we will hear from all 8 individuals, and then after the last presentation, we will have a question and answer round, whereby you can ask questions to any of the researchers. And we also encourage people online to ask questions, and they will be read out loud by James, who's monitoring the chat box. There are refreshments in the room. I see many of you have discovered them already, so that's very good. If you want to have more, feel free to walk around during the event and get some further beverages or snacks. So with that, it's my great pleasure to introduce the first speaker. And the first speaker is Lindsay Larios. Now I'm probably mispronouncing it, but Larios. And Lindsay is an interdisciplinary critical policy researcher with the Faculty of Social Work. So Lindsay studies citizenship and immigration as it interacts with family and reproductive justice. And the keywords that Lindsay submitted and are relevant to her research are reproductive justice, migration, pregnancy, healthcare, and immigration status. So with that, please welcome Lindsay.
Great, good afternoon. Thank you all for coming, and thank you for this invitation to share a bit about my work with you all. So since about the mid-2000s, Canada has accepted more people into its borders on a temporary basis than for permanent settlement. As a result, there's an increasing number of people whose residency in Canada is contingent and relatively unstable, and whose access to basic services may be restricted, putting them in a position of relative precarity compared to Canadian citizens or permanent residents. This includes people who have come as migrant workers or any type of temporary worker, international students, asylum seekers, and visitors who are here for a number of reasons, including as family sponsorship applicants. Importantly, roughly half of these new entrants are identified as female, and the majority of which can be categorized as of childbearing age. Given this, questions of reproductive health and what migrants with uteruses actually need in order to be equitably supported and equitably impacted by our immigration systems becomes very important, especially in a national and international context where attention to gender has been widely seen as necessary. That said, pregnancy and birth by people without permanent status is a contentious issue for many states, including Canada, as they manage the boundaries of the welfare state and citizenship inclusion. As a result, migrants with uteruses face many challenges navigating the immigration system and accessing basic reproductive services and protections. So much of my work examines this nexus of immigration and reproductive justice. My work aims to highlight how policies and politics, both of immigration and reproduction, inform each other and play out in the everyday in people's lives. I've examined this issue in Quebec and Manitoba in particular, as well as cross-provincially in collaboration with research partners. So today I've just selected a couple of quotations from interviews conducted in Montreal and Winnipeg that highlight some of the key issues that individuals are facing. So the first quote I have up there is from Amrita, who came to Canada for a family wedding and ended up having to stay due to complications with her pregnancy. Her health travel insurance didn't cover the cost of giving birth, so she paid out of pocket. She recalls being asked to go down to the hospital accounting department to pay her bill just an hour and a half after giving birth. The second passage is from Eloise, who was a temporary worker in a small IT company for 3 years. Her work permit expired mid-pregnancy, and her employer refused to renew it, meaning she lost access to her income, as well as her healthcare insurance and immigration stability. Although she was de facto fired for being pregnant, she had no recourse because employers don't need to justify why work permits aren't renewed. Marisol is a spousal sponsorship applicant, living with her partner in Montreal, waiting for her application to be processed. She describes the difficulty finding a doctor without health insurance and the harmful attitudes she encountered when trying to access care. And lastly, the quote from Nadia speaks to her experience as an international student here in Manitoba, whose private healthcare insurance would not cover her labor and delivery. Although she was able to work out a payment plan with the hospital, her family still encountered threats that border services would be called on them if they defaulted on their payment. Although different provinces have a range of different policies when it comes to this, we see these kinds of experiences play out across the country and across the full range of our temporary immigration programs. By listening to these stories, we can see that healthcare decision-making is being constrained in ways that significantly impact the physical and mental health of the pregnant person, their families, and their communities. People end up taking health risks and not seeking care because of financial constraints and fears. And very often, service providers and community workers have very limited avenues to assist these patients in really holistic ways. So if we're serious about gender justice and equality as a global human right, this has to extend to immigration and all of our programs. And we have to take seriously the challenges and the harms caused by precarious migration and work towards greater immigration stability and greater access to basic services for all our community members, regardless of status. And I think that's probably my 5 minutes, so I'll leave it there, and thank you. I look forward to any questions and chatting with you later. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Lindsay, for heading off the first one. Thank you for sharing that information and making us aware about this. So the next speaker is Tara Horrill, and Tara is from the College of Nursing at the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences. Tara's research examines health equity with a particular focus on improving care for people who are marginalized and living with cancer. The keywords relevant to Tara's research are health equity, access to care, cancer, and marginalized populations. The floor is yours.
Okay, thanks very much for this invitation and opportunity to speak today. I want you to imagine for a moment that you are diagnosed with cancer after being admitted to a hospital following a suicide attempt as a result of your struggles with mental health and substance use challenges. You're currently living in your car because of these challenges, struggling to get by every day. Despite this, you understand your new diagnosis of cancer and you want to be able to get treatment. But in order for you to get treatment, you need to be able to complete a detox program before leaving the hospital. You do this, and then you're discharged to a transitional housing facility where there are others also struggling with substance use. You relapse, you're evicted from the housing facility, and once again you find yourself homeless. You make every attempt to attend your cancer appointments, but without a fixed address, a phone, a computer, the cancer center cannot reach you, and continuing on your cancer treatment without any housing is increasingly dangerous. Over the past several decades in Canada, we've seen quite tremendous advances in the detection and treatment of cancer. And yet there continues to be, some very alarming and significant disparities related to cancer outcomes and access to cancer care. We know that people who are considered structurally marginalized, like the example that I just gave, are more likely to be diagnosed with cancers that are preventable, to be diagnosed with cancers that require more complex treatments, to die of cancers that are preventable or treatable. In terms of cancer treatment, we know that people who are socially disadvantaged for different reasons are less likely to ever be seen by a cancer specialist if they are diagnosed. They're less likely to receive treatment, and if they do receive treatment, it is more likely to be of lower quality or to be delayed in some way. And I think that we can probably do better than that. So with that in mind, I've created and launched a program of research called REACH, Research to Advance Cancer Health Equity. And so what we're doing is really aiming to advance social justice by conducting research that drives policy and practice change to improve cancer outcomes and equitable access to care for people who are structurally marginalized. And so what I'm going to do today is just highlight a couple of our key projects. In this first project, I've partnered with the University of British Columbia, University of Victoria, and BC Cancer, and we are using a critical ethnographic approach to better understand how cancer services could be better designed and delivered to meet the needs of people who are highly marginalized. We're working very closely with a community-based primary healthcare organization that provides health and social services to people experiencing things like extreme poverty, unstable housing or homelessness, substance use challenges, and so on, in order to really integrate the perspectives of people with lived experience of structural marginalization. We have some preliminary findings right now, and we're in the process of returning to our participants and community partners to look at those findings and to begin to really co-develop a set of recommendations for cancer care organizations that focus on the kinds of organizational level changes that could make services more accessible, welcoming, and equity focused. The second project is actually an engagement project funded by the Center for Healthcare Innovation here at U Manitoba. And although I'm leading this project, it really is very much in partnership with Indigenous and non-Indigenous researchers, healthcare providers, and an elder. And through a series of sharing circles, our goal is to build culturally respectful relationships that will inform research priority setting and hopefully eventually lead to a collaborative research project. We're about 2/3 of the way done through these sharing circles, and what we've seen is that they've really opened space for elders and Indigenous cancer survivors to share their perspectives, to support one another, and then also we've really seen how they've privileged Indigenous voices and sort of disrupted this tendency for non-Indigenous knowledges and voices to dominate. This last study is the most recently funded study, and we're just launching it this month, actually. It's a 5-year study focused on examining inequities in access to lung cancer treatment for people who are experiencing socioeconomic disadvantage in Manitoba. We're using a few different research methods here, really focused first on understanding the barriers to accessing lung cancer treatment, and then looking elsewhere at where there have been interventions, policies, models of care successfully implemented to improve access to lung cancer treatment. Ultimately, we hope that this lays the foundation for a future implementation project over the next many years. And that study is being done with the advisory of a community advisory board made of people who have lived and living experience of structural marginalization as well as cancer, and in collaboration with some clinicians and decision makers at Cancer Care Manitoba. Just a quick acknowledgement of our funders, and if you would like to learn more or follow what we're up to, here is how you can do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tara, and telling us about your important work. Thank you very much. Up next is Akinwumi Ogunrani from the Faculty of Law. And Akinwumi specializes in business, human rights, and international issues. He's a lawyer in both Canada and Nigeria. The keywords relevant to Akinwumi's research are business and human rights, Ubuntu, corporate responsibility to respect human rights. The floor is yours.
Thank you. I was a little bit early. Good afternoon, everyone. I will be talking about, yeah, it works. All right. I'll be talking about localizing human rights. For everyone sitting here, you'll probably be wondering, what does that mean? Right, so what does localizing human rights mean for people in the room or even outside this audience? But I work in a field called business and human rights. We look at the impact of business activities on local communities, on human lives, right? And the question is, what should be the relationship between corporations and the local communities in which they operate? Now, there have been international guidance instruments, there have been international law norms that, try to prescribe a particular framework under which corporations should relate with local communities. And one of them is the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. Now, this is more like an international social norm that prescribes that corporations should respect human rights. But the question my research focuses on is, what does that mean? If we ask corporations to respect human rights, what does it mean to local farmers in the bush? What does it mean to local traders in Africa? Right, so my research looks at the relationship between local communities and corporations and how there can be an effective dialogue between these two parties. So the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights provides that corporations should respect human rights. Now, my work looks at how local communities would interpret the word respect, right? So if we're saying that corporations should respect human rights, it's more about the subject or the object of that respect than the person given the respect. What do they want? And that's where my second column there comes in. I look at how we can reinterpret the word respect in local languages, right? Such that if, say, for example, we are talking about respect in Africa, what kind of norm embodies the word respect? And that's where the word Ubuntu comes from. Ubuntu is a norm in Africa that talks about interdependence, community living, promoting human welfare and the community. And I argue, and this is what I do continuously in my work, that for corporations to actually get the social license in Africa, the legitimacy to work in Africa, they must speak the language of the local communities, right? And I use a theory called the localization theory. I won't bore you with theories, so don't mind me. So, but that's exactly what I do with Ubuntu. How do we then find a congruence between international legal order and the local communities? It is more like a bottom-up approach rather than a top-down approach from international law. And then my last column talks about applying that theory actually to benefit local communities, right? So if we're looking at interpreting international norms, how can we find congruence in domestic legislation, in domestic legal order that can support local interpretations of international norms? And I end with this quote, and probably this is my last slide. So this is a quotation from Steve Biko. It says that in the long run, the special contribution to the world by Africa will be in this field of human relationship. The powers of the world may have done wonders in giving the world an industrial and military look, but the great gift still has to come from Africa, giving the world a more human face. Now, my research is ongoing, and the next part of my project actually looks at what does it even mean, respect for indigenous peoples in Canada. Say, for example, we have the United Nations Declaration on Rights of Indigenous Peoples that talks about informed consent, right? What does it mean to indigenous peoples? How can we interpret those international legal norms to benefit local communities? I hope I've been able to at least convert some of you to localize human rights. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Akinwumi. I'm glad that I know now the meaning of Ubuntu, so thank you very much. I'm now pleased to introduce Curt McCartney from the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences, and Curt's research focuses on wheat breeding and the genetics of resistance to plant pathogens and insects. And the keywords relevant to Curt's research are wheat, breeding, genetics, and disease resistance.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to be talking mostly today about the plant breeding or the wheat breeding program at the university, and not overly much about the genetics research we're doing. For those of you who have no idea what a plant breeding program would be, really what we're trying to do is develop varieties at the end of the day. That's the product we're trying to develop. That's what a farmer will grow and seed into their field, and you see all the thousands of acres in Western Canada of wheat, and that is what it is. So we're trying to develop new varieties that are more productive than the current ones. And the process that we follow to do that is to cross some of the existing elite breeding germplasm, make new genetic variation, and from that genetic variation, select superior plants. And that takes, in the case of winter wheat, to go from the initial cross down to the F12 generation. That's going to take about 12 years, because winter wheat is in the field for 11 months of the year. It's sown in the fall, and it's harvested in early August. So that is the process. We are constantly making new crosses. We're making about 40 crosses per year. And every year we have plants at every stage along this process, and hopefully at the end of the day we develop new varieties. So in terms of increasing productivity, what we're meaning is increasing the tons of grain per hectare. And so the current sort of rate of increase would be somewhere along this line using these traditional plant breeding methodologies. At the very end of the day, we ultimately select our parents for making our new varieties about the F11 level. And so it takes 11 years to go through that entire breeding cycle before you're recycling back up to the top. What we're hoping to do is reduce the time that it takes to do that and have approximately the same genetic gain in that shorter period of time. So that would result in maybe picking your parents at the F7 level and cutting off 4 years off the breeding cycle, and then that would result in a change in the slope of the line here, and we'd have, over time, much more productive varieties. Finally, I think with what we're ultimately hoping to do would be with the genomic selection methodologies we're working on with DNA markers would be to pick superior F1 plants, and then after one generation, go back to using those F1 plants as new parents in the breeding program. You could get it down to, if you're really working quickly, get down to 6 months because you can grow winter wheat in about 6 months in a greenhouse. So that would be the ultimate goal. In terms of when you're inbreeding the material to get to this stage, we first start off with single rows. Usually they're 1 meter long rows, and we have thousands of those rows in the field each year. We pick ones we like the best in terms of maybe like reduced plant height. So plant height's an important trait for wheat. If a crop is too tall, when you apply nitrogen fertilizer, it tends to fall over in the field, and that causes big problems for the farmers when they're harvesting. So we're looking at using LiDAR sensors with drones to help us select for plant height. You can see this is a trial in our field plots here at the east end of campus. Different plots, yield plots, look like this. You can see an individual plot here, and this would be the vertical view of the plot, and you can see data points that are above the soil surface, so we can figure out how tall the plants are with using LiDAR sensors. Other things we're working on are disease resistance. So we're really concerned with the different diseases that are important in the fields in Manitoba particularly, but also the other diseases across Western Canada. So there's variation within the species for susceptibility. So yeah, this would be really bad, particular wheat line, very susceptible to this fungal pathogen. Here's another wheat line that's quite resistant to the fungal pathogen, and it has a lot less of the toxin that is produced by that fungus. Similarly, there's other diseases like leaf rust and stem rust caused by 2 other fungal pathogens, and they are also causing damage to the crop, and we're trying to reduce damage by developing new varieties that are inherently resistant to these pathogens. So this type of work is done at the early stages in our single rows. And then when we're trying to evaluate finally the grain yield, we have to wait till the later generations before we have a lot less breeding material. And then they go into yield plots. And they are ultimately grown in plots all over Western Canada at the very final stages. So typically the material is grown in 12 different locations per year. And we get a better broad sense how adapted it is to the wider growing region that a particular variety might be grown in. As we get to the very end of the breeding cycle, we're also looking at grain quality. Obviously, wheat is used to make dough, flour and dough, and the performance of the dough has to be sufficient that a customer would be interested in purchasing the grain. And so that's a really important criteria as well. And finally, I guess we are using these DNA markers to allow us to select for the different genes that we're interested in the breeding programs, and ultimately to enable us to do these alterations in the breeding cycle so that we are able to generate higher yielding varieties in a shorter period of time. And I'll be happy to take any questions after the session's over.
Thank you very much, Curt. Now we know the research behind the dough and the flour and the bread, so thank you very much. The next speaker is Liao from the Asper School of Business. Kjell is focusing on the determinants of financial decisions to develop better understanding of observed behaviors. And the keywords to this research are behavioral finance and household finance.
All right, thank you for having me here today. To start, I want to give you some background. So in traditional or neoclassical finance, what I like to call sort of old school finance, we tend to make really strong assumptions, right? The most important of which is that humans, that we all make decisions in a very rational, very logical manner, right? And this means that things like emotions, biases, our mental health, these things don't matter, right? It also assumes that we only care about ourselves, we don't care about anybody else, we only care about maximizing our utility or happiness over our wealth. These are the only things we care about, right? And of course, these assumptions can be very useful. They're also oversimplifications, right? So what behavioral finance does is it takes this sort of human element into account, right? We're all human. We have emotions that can affect our decision making. We have biases. We care about, people other than ourselves. Behavioral finance tries to take all this into account. It comes from more of a positive approach in trying to explain how people actually behave, whereas in traditional finance, it's very much a normative approach, looking at how people should make decisions and how people should behave. Okay, so that's sort of the difference between traditional finance and behavioral finance, which is sort of the umbrella that my research falls under. More specifically, we're applying psychology, sociology, but also other social sciences to finance to try to have a better understanding of how people, firms, and markets behave. Okay, so that's sort of general overview of behavioral finance. My research in particular, I focus on individuals and households and how individuals and households make financial decisions and what their financial outcomes look like. So for example, in finance, we're very concerned about stock market participation, right? Traditional finance tells us that all of us should have at least a little bit of our wealth invested in the stock market. But in reality, we see that less than 50%, probably around 30 to 40% of the population invests or participates in the stock market at all, right? So that's sort of a puzzle because stock market participation is such an important component of wealth accumulation, which of course is really important for retirement, right? To have enough retirement savings. So that's a really important area of my research. Also, how we form our portfolios, how much we allocate to cash, to bonds, to stocks, or to real estate. Also important in how much wealth we can accumulate by retirement. Other decisions like whether or not we decide to own a home, whether or not we decide to become entrepreneurs, and also things like what's the probability that we can pay our bills on time, make ends meet, that sort of thing. So those are sort of all the financial outcomes that I'm interested in. And in relation to those outcomes, I'm interested in sort of the individual, environmental, societal factors that affect those decisions and outcomes, right? So one area of my research focuses on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, so ADHD, right? If we have really strong ADHD symptoms when we're children or we're genetically predisposed to ADHD, how does that affect, how much we're able to save for retirement, whether we're more likely to be financially distressed, and also the role of treatment and coping with ADHD, what that means for financial outcomes as well. I'm also interested in race or racism, so things like racial residential segregation, police violence, how these things can impact your trust in financial systems, your health, and subsequently your financial decision making. Gender, or more specifically gender norms, how that affects specifically women's likelihood of participating in the stock market. Investing and finance tend to be sort of masculine traits. So, how we're socialized as children, particularly girls, can make us less likely to sort of explore those, explore investing, right? And lastly, I look at how sort of environmental factors and our personal experiences can also affect these financial decisions and outcomes. So thank you. I'm happy to answer questions after.
Thank you very much, Chi. And maybe you can give us some advice of how to invest. That will be great as well. So the next speaker is Mercedes Garcia Holguera from the Faculty of Architecture. And Mercedes specializes in biomaterials in architecture for environmental solutions. And the keywords relevant to Mercedes' research are biomaterials, biomimetic design, and we're going to learn about that, biological inspired design, and biomimicry. I hope I pronounced that reasonably, but we will hear.
That was good. Thank you, everybody. So yes, I'm going to talk today about biomaterials and the work that we do at the Biome Lab. And when we talk about biomaterials, we refer to materials that can be generated by or from living organisms. And the reason why we work with biomaterials is because they can help us solve many environmental and societal problems that we architects and society in general are facing today. At the Biome Lab, we work mostly with two materials, with two organisms, fungi and bacterial cellulose. Within the fungi realm, we work with mycelium, which is the vegetative part of the fungi, and we mix mycelium with different industrial and agricultural waste to produce different products. So on the upper part of the image, you can see some of the panels that we grow and test for thermal performance, hoping that in the future we can replace current insulating materials in our buildings. On the bottom left, you can see some of the samples that we grow and test for compression strength. And on the bottom right, you can see a microscopy image of one of our samples. And this is just to show you that we work in collaboration with many researchers and disciplines on campus, and we wouldn't be able to do our work without their support. The other biomaterial we work with is bacterial cellulose. This is a biofilm that results of the symbiotic collaboration between bacteria and yeast. This material, it's antibacterial, it's hydrophilic, it's biodegradable, and it has great tensile strength. In our first explorations, we were dyeing the bacterial cellulose and using different techniques. And we had a chance to show our work at the Nuit Blanche exhibition in 2022. And it was the first chance that we had to share our work with the general public, and it was a very satisfying experience. We are also very interested in testing and understanding the effects of braiding and weaving techniques in bacterial cellulose tensile strength or tensile properties. And even if we are still too far from current or commercial products, we have great expectations. And this is our last installation at the Forest School. And here we are trying to see what is the elongation of our bacterial cellulose ropes, and also how weather affects the material. And in terms of weathering, we've also run an experiment here in Winnipeg and in Churchill in 2022 and 2023. And in this case, we had several samples in protected and semi-protected conditions, and we saw how the materials change through time. And next I'm going to show you a time lapse of images that we took over 1 year, and what we observed was that yes, bacterial cellulose degrades in outdoor conditions, but it degrades at a much slower pace than we thought. So even the thinner samples, they didn't break, they maintained their physical integrity, and they kept in better shape than the ones that we have indoors. Also, there wasn't any degradation due to animals, insects interaction, and the biggest change was in the color of our samples. So we think there is great potential for this material to be used as an outdoor material, maybe in temporary structures or even in transitional buffering, thermal buffering spaces. And finally, I want to show you this project. This is a dome that we built last year, also with bacterial cellulose mostly. And in this case, what we are trying to do is to explore larger samples of bacterial cellulose and trying to get closer to the scale of architectural construction materials. And again, we are trying to observe the degradation due to weathering patterns, also color, changes in color, also different coatings and finishes of the material, different thickness of the bacterial cellulose. And even if we know that there are great challenges ahead, like for example, it's hard to change or to scale up samples from the lab to the architectural scale. It is also hard to mass produce samples of biomaterials. And there's also issues with the replicability and homogeneity of final products, and more than anything, societal misconceptions. We need to address all of these, but we are very much looking forward to it. And I want to thank everybody, and especially the students that are helping us move forward with this. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mercedes. What beautiful colors as well. It's nice to see. Thank you for teaching us about this. So the next person is Kjell Anderson from the Faculty of Law. And Kjell's research focuses on perpetrators of international crimes, including the criminology of genocide, transitional justice, and hate crimes. And keywords to describe Kjell's research include perpetrators, criminology, mass atrocities, and international crimes. The floor is yours.
Bedankt, Anamika. It's so cool to hear what everybody else is doing, the diversity of things. It's always exciting working in a university. So as Anamika said, I am an assistant prof in the Faculty of Law, and I also direct the master's program in human rights. So the image on the slide almost appears a bit abstract, but what we're actually looking at here is a person's wallet. And even more specifically, we're looking at a mass grave in northern Iraq in the Sinjar region. So I took this photo in 2016 when I was in the area looking at evidence of international crimes, and especially speaking with victims from minority communities, victims of the Islamic State. So I don't actually know who this wallet belonged to, but it's very likely that it belonged to an Yazidi woman who was a victim of this genocide, which had begun 2 years earlier, a genocide against the Yazidi group in northern Iraq. So I think this image, the reason I picked this image is it's kind of emblematic, I think, of the paradoxical nature of mass atrocities, because on the one hand, mass atrocities are all about depersonalization. People are being targeted just because they're belonging to particular social groups. They have no unique individual characteristics beyond that. At the same time, of course, the results of genocide, the results of mass atrocities are inescapably very personal. The person whose the wallet this was, of course, they had a family, and this kind of reverberates through the generations. So essentially the kind of work I do is really centered on trying to understand mass atrocities, including genocide, and also looking at how law and policy can address mass atrocities, how it can prevent mass atrocities. A lot of my work actually involves sitting face to face with victims and even more commonly with perpetrators of mass atrocities to try to understand what took place and why and all these key kinds of questions. And I've done that. I've done it with many victims. I've done it with hundreds of perpetrators of genocide and other mass atrocities, crimes against humanity mostly, in Rwanda, in Burundi, in Uganda, in Bosnia, Cambodia, Bangladesh, and I'm probably forgetting some as well. So this is basically the kind of work I do. My work is very interdisciplinary, so it's spanning law and the social sciences as well as history. And yeah, in terms of the actual, I guess the kinds of methods I use in my work, usually it involves interviewing, and I find there's something quite powerful about sitting face to face with someone and hearing their story in their own words. So that's mostly what I do. I do other things as well, like legal research and stuff like that. But a lot of my research just involves sitting with somebody and talking to them about what they experienced or what they did in many cases. So just sort of very briefly explaining how this sort of has panned out in terms of my larger projects. So my first book, it was a book on perpetrators of mass atrocities, and it's basically a criminological exploration of why people perpetrate. So I would have spoken to a lot of perpetrators for this particular project. Then I went on and I published a book on basically on research methods in terms of doing research on perpetrators of mass atrocities and the kinds of, I mean, you can imagine, I'm sure, but the kinds of ethical and methodological dilemmas that you run into in that kind of research, how you gain access to people, how you deal with trauma and all these kinds of issues. And then I have another book which is coming out later this year, which is the story of an individual perpetrator, in fact. So it's somebody, Dominic Ongwen, somebody who was abducted at around the age of 9 years old when he was walking to school. This was in northern Uganda, and he was abducted by Joseph Koi's Lord's Resistance Army. And basically, he was forced to perpetrate atrocities as a child, went on to become a commander in the group, and was recently convicted by the International Criminal Court of war crimes and crimes against humanity. So I've written a book about his life, which I think will come out later this year. And that's basically centered on the stories of people who knew him. So it's centered on, a lot of people who were with him in the Lord's Resistance Army, people who were his victims, people who were his wives, people who worked on his trial, this kind of thing. And in terms of what I'm working on right now, I'm working on a couple of graphic novels. One is on the Yazidi genocide and one is on the Syrian civil war. So each of these graphic novels is essentially the story of one person, and this is funded by Shirk as well. So it's essentially the story of one person, and then we're using these novels to create pedagogical materials to teach people about genocide, mass atrocities, and of course human rights more broadly. I'm also starting to work on a couple of other books, I guess. I'm working on a handbook of perpetrator studies, and later this year, I'm also going to begin work on a book on the Rohingya genocide, which is also what I'll be, of course, pertaining to Myanmar. So that's what I'll be doing on my sabbatical in about a year's time, I guess. Probably going to Bangladesh and speaking to people in refugee camps about what they experienced during this genocide. So that's kind of me in a nutshell. So I'm drawn to work that I hope has some social impact, from my own perspective. And beyond that, I guess I really appreciate the teaching part of my job as well, because, our students in the master's program are great, and we're sort of training the next generation of human rights advocates, I think, if that's not immodest to say so. But that's the kind of stuff that excites me. So thanks, everybody.
Dank u wel, Kjell. Thank you for expressing this important work. Our final presenter of today is Asher Mendelson from the Rady Faculty of Health Sciences. Asher aims to improve on the exchange of knowledge between scientists and clinicians to significantly improve patient outcome in critical care. And keywords relevant to Asher's research are critical illness, microcirculation, skeletal muscle, recovery, and oxygen.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity to present today. So I'm going to talk about my research program looking at translational methods to improve ICU outcomes. So I work in the ICU as a critical care physician, and we deal with a number of life-threatening diseases, all of which have a very high mortality, about 1 in 3 chance of death. Despite our best efforts and despite decades of research, this level of mortality has remained unacceptably high. And this is something that, as a community, we became all too aware of during the most recent COVID-19 pandemic. For those 2 in 3 patients that do survive, that doesn't necessarily mean that they recover. And often, patients will develop post-intensive care syndrome, which is a constellation of physical, emotional, and cognitive disabilities leading to reduced quality of life, increased healthcare utilization, and importantly, increased burden on family members, caregivers, and the community at large. So, these are the issues that I deal with from a clinical side, and from a research perspective, my focus is primarily on the microcirculation, which is the smallest blood vessels in the body, and it does a number of very important roles, particularly related to oxygen delivery. So right now, as you sit here, you have an innumerable amount of red blood cells coursing through trillions of capillaries. This is a video from one of our microscopic techniques. And when I think about it both abstractly, and I also think about it very literally as being able to count these beautiful red blood cells delivering oxygen one by one as they course through capillaries. And what I do at the bedside from a research perspective is I use advanced biomedical tools like near-infrared spectroscopy, shining light through tissue to understand how red blood cells and oxygen delivery are affected by critical illness. So most of the time when we're treating patients in the ICU, we think about blood pressure, but actually the status of your microcirculation does a much better job of predicting outcomes, and what we want to do is we want to give clinicians the tools to unlock these beautiful mysteries of the microcirculation at the bedside. When we think about recovery and we think about physical disability for these patients, a lot of them have what's called ICU-acquired weakness, and traditionally this has been thought of simply as a defect in the muscle themselves, which is very true. You lose quite a lot of skeletal muscle mass because of how sick you are in the ICU. But the perspective that we're bringing to this type of condition is that when you think about weakness, and in muscle in particular, you have to think about the defects in oxygen delivery to the muscle, and that relates to defects in the entire oxygen pathway from mouth to mitochondria. And so what we're trying to understand is how defects in the microcirculation impact the ability of survivors to get up and go and live vibrant and healthy lives. Changing focus just a little bit, I have a bench to bedside research program where we use small animal models of critical illness similar to the types of diseases that we encounter in the clinic. And one of the things I do is I lead a consortium, what's called the National Preclinical Sepsis Platform, and the rationale of this is similar to clinical studies. You would never make a change in healthcare policy based on an individual clinical study from a single hospital. You need multi-center clinical trials, and this really hasn't broken through into the preclinical environment. Often, basic science studies are done in individual labs, and what we are doing is a multi-center preclinical study where numerous basic science labs across the country are all running the same experiments at the same time in order to generate robust knowledge that can lead to effective translations. So ICU patients suffer from short and long-term outcomes that limit their survival. I think this research, my research, focuses on applications of innovative technologies and diseases from a new perspective and bringing a bench to bedside translational impact. And I'd just like to acknowledge all the members of my lab and my funding sources. Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much, Asher. Thank you also for telling us about the national platform. That's great. So with that, we're moving on to the questions. So if you have a question here in the room, please raise your hand and we will bring a microphone. The speakers are all at the table, so I will see who wants to address the question. Oh, they're not all on the table, they're dispersed, but close enough. But you can either specifically address the question to someone or have a quite general question, and then I will just take hands of the speakers who wants to address that question. If you're joining us online, please post your question in the comment section on YouTube, and then they will be read out loud once I find James in the room. But we will find him. Oh, there he is. Hi, James. So I'm just wondering who has a question for the speakers. There we go. Nazim.
Thank you, everybody, and really enjoyed the presentations. I'll just start things off. This question is to Lindsay. When you presented, Lindsay, I was interested in the international student health insurance related issues. Had conversations with a number of our graduate students who are going through the transition of who pays for it, access to it, what does it cover, what does it not cover. Can you speak to that a bit more? Might be just here at the U of M, but more generally what international students go through, and there's a national scope now with the limiting of access to our international programs. So, thank you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the question. Certainly, international students are one of the probably the largest group that we have in Canada that are uninsured, though it does vary across province. So in Manitoba, Ontario, and Quebec, those are the three provinces where international students do not have any access to public health insurance. If you go west, it looks a bit different. So in Saskatchewan, Alberta, they do. In BC, they do, but they have to pay a fee monthly. So it looks very different in different provinces in a way that I'm not sure international students are fully informed of when they select their universities and where they're going. In terms of Manitoba, international students were covered until 2018, and then it was their eligibility was revoked by the provincial government. At that time, international students were then kind of forced into the private system, and different universities and colleges have different private insurance companies that they work with. So U of M is Blue Cross and tends to be quite robust. But some of the smaller colleges work with different insurers that are less so. And then there are gaps that occur, in particular, so if you think about the issue of pregnancy, if somebody comes and they're already past usually 12 weeks along, that's considered a pre-existing condition. So then their private insurer is not going to cover that, which tends to happen a lot. And there are, the other major gap we see is when students have graduated or are changing institutions, and there could be a gap between their study permit and their work permit, and that also means a gap in their health insurance. So over the course of the pandemic, we had a number of more high-profile cases like this in Manitoba, where we had international students with bills of 30 grand, 100 grand. So it's a significant issue. I will say the current government has promised to address this issue. It is in the mandate letter for the Minister of Higher Ed, which is wonderful news, but we would ideally like to see this in place before September and we have the next cohort of students. So that's, for the community work I do, that's kind of our next project, is to think about how we can make that a priority for folks. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that. Mario.
Thanks, Anamika. Mario Pinto, Vice President of Research. Let me start by complimenting all of the speakers. University of Manitoba is clearly in good hands here, and we're destined for a brilliant future. So I'm very encouraged and enthused. I have questions of four of the speakers. So my fine Nigerian colleague to the right here, on perceptions. I just returned from Kenya, where homosexuality is a criminal activity, right? And in particular, male homosexuality and transsexuality carries a huge stigma to the point where these individuals are refused treatment or brutalized by the police force. So this has led to public sector violation of human rights. I realize that you're dealing with corporate sector and private sector violation of human rights, but do you have any insights on the public sector aspects, or will you be pursuing those aspects?
Nice, thank you. This is one of the questions I actually faced when I was doing my PhD, right? One of the questions is if I'm talking about Ubuntu being interdependence, promoting human welfare. So why do we still have atrocities? Why do we still have human rights abuse in Africa? And my natural reaction is that there is a norm, there's a social norm. Now, the fact that people sometimes comply or they don't, it's a different ballgame entirely, right? But my research has majorly focused on corporations, right? So I would probably be going towards Kjell's research if I'm looking at the public law part. That's the public international law, right? But my research actually looks at how corporations, and sometimes corporations are even implicated in these atrocities, right? So my research only would come into play where corporations actually fuel these activities. Say, for example, land grabbing, right? So my argument is that, yes, there are social norms like Ubuntu, but I still do not, I still acknowledge that there are instances of human rights abuses like, just like you mentioned, but there is still a social norm that people should comply with. Now, the human rights abuse can actually be punished by the state sometimes, or sometimes the state can even empower people to actually abuse human rights, and that's probably Kjell's research, but I look at the corporations.
I still find it paradoxical. I can't resist that your initial claim that Africa would teach the rest of the world how to behave and in a humane way, right? And yet the atrocities continue, not just in Africa, of course. Question for the gentleman on the right. On the left, pardon me. How do you deal with nations that deny atrocities? For example, Pakistan and Bangladesh.
Thank you, Mario. Well, that's a tricky one. Of course, there are some states that go so far as to have genocide denial laws. Actually, Canada recently moved Holocaust denial into our hate speech provisions in the criminal code, but only the Holocaust, actually, not other genocides. But in terms of denying genocide, basically, if the perpetrators win, then the genocide is going to be denied. That's basically, so yeah, of course you have, without going into all the history, you have examples like Rwanda, where essentially the perpetrators were displaced. You have other examples, like you mentioned, Pakistan or Bangladesh in 1971, the second partition. In a sense, the perpetrators were not displaced, but they fled, of course, Bangladesh. And a lot of the perpetrators are in Pakistan. Some are still in Bangladesh, people who are the so-called Razakars and different paramilitary groups that were involved in 1971. But on this broader question of denial, the thing is that in those states where the regime committing the atrocities was not displaced or upended or overthrown, then of course it can become tied up in national identity. So if we think of the example, and I'm going into controversial territory as I always am with these things, but you think of the Armenian genocide and the continuing denial of Turkey of the Armenian genocide, and of course that's partly because in a sense, the young Turks and kind of some of the formative figures of modern Turkey were in some ways involved in the genocide or implicated in the genocide. So Turkish identity kind of doesn't allow it to think of itself as a state that has committed genocide. So I'm not sure how you deal with that. Sometimes you can deal with it through the legal system. We have that with Germany and Namibia. Of course, there was a genocide in German Southwest Africa in 1905 or 1904 to around 1907 or 1908. And Namibia has taken Germany to court seeking damages for the victims of that genocide and to receive a settlement much like Holocaust victims received, many years ago. And that has sort of happened a bit, but not happened entirely. So it's a tricky thing to deal with because part of it might be legal, but a lot of it is political and embedded in identity, I would say. That might have been a long answer. I'm sorry if it was too long.
It's clear that you have a lifetime of research ahead of you, right? Annemieke, may I be permitted 2 quick ones?
You're my boss, so for sure, yeah.
I'm not your boss today. I have a question on the cellulose. Why bacterial cellulose and not plant cellulose, microcrystalline cellulose, for example?
Is it working? Yeah.
Yeah.
So according to research, and this is a little bit out of the scope, our scope is basically some things that we have learned from other disciplines. Bacterial cellulose is able to produce 100% of cellulose, whereas in plants, the amount of cellulose that is produced is in the range of, if I remember correctly, 30–40%. So it is far more efficient at producing cellulose.
Are the properties fairly similar?
I wouldn't be able to respond to that with confidence. Yeah. I can come back to you later.
I'm interested, so please do. And one very quick question. An image of Spock always brings something out in me. So on behavioral finance, right? Have you thought about looking at artificial intelligence methods to sense sentiment as a driver of behavioral financial decisions?
Like in sort of tweets or on social media, that sort of. I know people have looked at sentiment using tweets, but I don't know if anybody's used AI to, I guess, measure sentiment. I think in finance, what people are interested in is AI investment advisors to help people manage their sentiment, and there's varying success depending on the type of AI, but no, I'm not too familiar with, I personally am not too familiar with AI.
Yeah, I think if you turn it on its head and look at sentiment as the driver and having control of that sentiment, it's a very powerful construct, right? For example, in investment.
Using AI to control sentiment?
To sense it, actually.
Yeah, quite possibly. Yes.
I'll stop, Annemieke.
Thank you. I hear 2 new student projects, so that's good. Are there any other questions from people? Yes, there's Allison, and then James has one online.
Hi, this is for Curt. I found your talk on wheat really interesting and didn't know so much went into selecting the varieties. And I guess I got thinking about gluten. I know that's on people's minds a lot lately. Is there any explanation or any insight from you about why so many people are intolerant and why is this becoming, I don't know if that's something you study, but.
I would not have any informed opinion on that. I think allergies and insensitivities, you'll find them in different areas of the world where certain, like the major foods people are eating are growing. So like I think like in Asia, there's allergies to like rice and things like that too. So it's not unique to wheat. I think probably the protein, like that gluten is the protein in the wheat seed, and there's a lot of protein there, and I think there must be there are features with the amino acids that are in the protein that are causing issues. But the gluten itself is actually what makes wheat good for making flour, and we are not really trying to remove gluten from the wheat. And even the idea of like, there's been some talk about breeding wheat that has less problems for insensitivities or maybe even for celiac disease. But that would create new issues with how you segregate the safe wheat from the traditional wheat. Like say if we're growing 10% of the acres are growing a safe wheat for people who are sensitive to gluten and the 90% isn't, how would you prevent mixing at the grain elevator of these types? So it could be a massive lawsuit or people being really negatively affected. So I don't think that's something I'm ever planning on tackling myself, but it's a very interesting topic.
Thank you, Curt. James.
So I have an online question for Dr. Ogunrani. To what extent is your research integrating corporate due diligence to the Ubuntu regime?
Great question, and that's a very brilliant question. My research actually looks at corporate due diligence. In fact, the bulk of it is corporate due diligence, right? So corporate due diligence talks about interacting with the community to actually create a multi-stakeholder framework for consultation. So in looking at speaking the languages of local communities, especially in Africa, then the basis of that consultation should be based on social norms in Africa like Ubuntu. So corporate human rights due diligence cannot successfully, or let me put a kind of nuance here, it may be difficult to achieve if we don't actually consider the social norms in Africa like Ubuntu. So the bedrock of corporate due diligence, which is consultation, should include Ubuntu. So, and that corporate due diligence now, it's something I'm looking at in my next paper. I'm looking at how corporate due diligence can incorporate local norms in remedying harms, in remedying abuses, human rights abuses. Say, for example, a local community member can just require apology. That's all, right? So, and if, say, for example, corporations do not actually speak that language of Ubuntu or the local norms in Africa, it will be difficult to remedy those abuses, those harms. So the bedrock for me, and to simply answer that question, is actually to localize that communication. And that's something I'll be looking at in my next paper. So thank you for that question.
Thank you. A question over there.
Yeah, I have a question to Curt about the wheat. Actually, two questions. First of all, is there not an effect on, I mean, there must be obviously an effect on the climate, on how the plants or the wheats grow. So how do you normalize for that when you compare over the years? And the second question is, it sounds a little bit tedious. I mean, is there no way that you, I'm sorry to say that, but is there no way that you can kind of predict outcomes a bit earlier than always waiting for a full year, as I understood? It sounds, is there no way to speed this up?
Okay, well, I guess maybe the second question I'll answer first. So what we're working on is trying to use DNA markers that are across all 21 chromosomes of the wheat genome and looking at correlations between those markers and beneficial traits that we're trying to select. So there is active research in that, and that, like where I mentioned, where we're trying to change where we're picking our parents from, that would be where we'd be applying that type of information to shorten the generation time from generations of crosses and making quicker advances. And I guess we're also, like all the genetic research we're doing as well, we're trying to identify DNA markers that are basically located in the genes or the variants that are causing the polymorphism that we're interested in or the variation in the trait we're interested in. So we can use those DNA markers to directly select for specific traits. So that's what we're trying to do to accelerate the process, but we are limited to the biology of the plant itself. So there's a limit to how quickly we can do that. What was the first question again? Weather. Yeah, I guess at present time, like with the very end of the breeding cycle where I mentioned the F10 to 12 generations are being grown across the prairies, that's a way for us to balance off various environmental conditions, particularly the winter. In the case of for winter wheat, it can be quite devastating to the crop if it's you don't have any snowfall and you have very cold temperatures. Then the crop is very vulnerable to freezing. So that would be one thing. So we're doing that, and also different growing years are going to have different amounts of precipitation across the prairie. So that's how we are manage that sort of environmental variation. And then with climate change, this is something we're very concerned about, what that could mean. Right now, winter wheat is a fairly minor crop in Western Canada. Spring wheat would be the main type of wheat that gets grown. But in Ontario, winter wheat is the main wheat, and it doesn't take very far. You don't have to go too far south before winter wheat becomes the main wheat. And with climate change, I think we're likely to see that the winter wheat will become much more common on the prairies because the winter get milder, there's less winter kill. And then if we have precipitation changes in the summer, like in July and August, if those 2 months get really dry, then you want to have the crop ripening before the drought starts. So like places like Oklahoma, that would be the condition that they're doing. They mainly have it growing, the crop is actively growing, say, February, and ripening off maybe in May. So that would be a way to, things we're trying to think about with climate change that's coming.
What about protein markers rather than DNA markers?
Well, that's a good question. There are, for the grain quality traits, we use NAR machines to measure the protein content of the grain. But then you can also run gels of the proteins themselves and select for specific polymorphisms in the glutenin proteins that are making up the gluten. And there are certain ones that are associated with better bread making quality. So that is something that is being done.
And if I may, one follow-up, Curt, like your graphs, they seem to steepen and then you have a little bit of a steeper slope. But there must be an end to the yield. And what would be the limiting factor? I mean, what would be, let's say, 30 years from now? Do you think your research will still improve varieties to the extent that the yield will still increase? Or is there a plateau at some point because we just can't do better? Maybe AI will help, but just wonder about that.
Well, there probably is a limit at some point. Wheat is still quite new to North America, and there's a lot of breeding work that we can do to increase the adaptation of the crop to North America. And as the climate is changing, what we'd be wanting for traits will also change. So we may, with climate change, we may actually be taking a few steps back on the genetic adaptation, and we might need to bring in some new traits that would improve the adaptation to the local conditions. Rainfall is one of the most important determinants of grain yield, and if we don't have rain, then we'll have a hard time producing wheat.
I was kind of hoping you said soil quality, but oh.
Another follow-up question. So the ultimate goal for the breeding is to increase input, but how does that impact on the application of herbicides and pesticides? Is your goal to reduce that ultimately? Because of course it has impact on farmers' bottom dollar.
Yep, okay, so with the work on disease resistance and insect resistance, that would reduce the inputs of those pesticides that would be used right now to manage those problems. Things we can do to improve, say, controlling weeds would be early biomass in the season where there's shading of the soil, and that would prevent weed seeds from germinating and provide better competition of the wheat crop versus other weeds. But there's a limit there too. And then with the climate change work, the federal government is wanting us to reduce the input of nitrogen fertilizer into cropping systems because the Haber-Bosch process that makes nitrogen fertilizers is carbon intensive. And so there's a whole lot of interesting work that needs to be done maybe in crop rotations, using legumes to produce the nitrogen that goes into the soil that we could use for growing other crops like wheat. So soybeans would be an interesting crop from that standpoint. It's productive for introducing nitrogen into the cropping system. So there's a whole bunch of new things that are coming along with climate change, unfortunately, that we need to be thinking about.
Thank you. Divya Thaur, Global Public Health, Community Health Sciences. Thank you for great presentations today. My question is a general one and really open to anyone, but perhaps maybe Tara, Lindsay, Kjell, and Akinwumi might consider this question. I'm wondering, particularly to the researchers who are working with marginalized and vulnerable populations and interlocutors, often we as researchers are sometimes accused of simply describing the problem and studying people to death. And I wondered how you see your role in upholding rights that are often in clear violation when you're bearing witness. And secondly, how you think your roles and your work are making a difference, perhaps as allies or advocates in the field.
That's a great question.
Yeah, thanks very much for that question. I guess I'll just answer it sort of from my own perspective of what I'm trying to do. And one of the things I talked about is actually involving a component in all of my projects that's not descriptive, that's more solution focused. And so it's definitely something that I want to move away from. I have noticed that a lot, at least in the specific area that I'm working in, so much of cancer disparities research is focused on just simply description, describing what the disparities are without ever looking at why they exist. And then going further, what could we actually do about that? And so I haven't been here very long, just over a year, but what I'm hoping to really eventually focus my program of research on is more looking at how services and policy interventions to actually address the reasons why the disparities exist. That's what I see my role as. I feel like sort of a responsibility in the research realm as a good citizen to actually try to make the change rather than just hearing the stories and not doing anything with them. So I hope that answers your question. Do you want to add in?
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a really great one. I do all of my research from a community-based perspective, so working often alongside with community partners to develop the project and to be involved in each stage of it as much as possible, with commitments to very specific deliverables like policy briefs and being available for consultations to policymakers, and also just providing any resources I can to those spaces in accordance to what they need or what would be helpful for their services. Yeah, very committed to mobilizing the data in really public-facing ways in order to see some policy change, because that's ultimately what it's all about for me. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's a very great question. Thank you. One of the ways I actually serve as an advocate is to construct what we call strategic litigation. How local communities can actually use courts for their benefit. And one of the ways I've done this is to propose solutions in one of my papers called Localizing Human Rights Interpretation to Pillar 2 of the UNGPS. What I did was to look at African charters that incorporate some of the values of Ubuntu and argue that local communities can actually mobilize to enforce these values through the African Charter. And when you look at courts in Africa, especially those in South Africa, they've been very proactive using Ubuntu to say that corporations don't just have the responsibility to prevent human rights abuse, but also to promote human rights, right? So one of the ways I at least modestly do in my paper is to propose strategic litigation options for local communities, which they can take up to enforce those rights that Ubuntu embodies. I hope that answers your question a bit.
Thanks, that was a great question. It's something I think about a lot. I mean, I think it has to do with two things, and one is kind of the way you do your work, and the other is what you do with your work, which are related but also somewhat separate questions. So I mean, I think I'm very conscious of being very extractive in my work, because I think a lot of academic research is extractive when you're dealing with people. And so I think shifting to more participatory approaches is often an appropriate way to do things and a better way of doing things. I think also in terms of what you do with your work, I mean, part of that relates to Akin's answer as well. So sometimes I'm engaged in policy or in litigation. Or I mean, to use the example of the ZD, you know, something I would hear from people when I was there in 2016 is a lot of people said to me, nobody's listening to us. Nobody, you know, and I'm a relatively lowly academic researcher, but people were still so excited that just somebody was there and somebody was actually speaking to them. So then I had the opportunity to speak at the Human Rights Council at the UN, for example, and also, to use this example, also working on this graphic novel now, thinking about speaking to other audiences, and more, you know, there are different kinds of research, so no shade on people who are doing different research, but I kind of don't want to be read by the same 10 people who are working on perpetrators and working on genocide, who we all know each other personally. We attend the same workshops and conferences, and it's great if they read my work, but I really want to speak to other audiences, which I think is ultimately a lot more important, actually. So, yeah, so it's kind of an ongoing consideration and an ongoing struggle, but I think that ethic has to drive and inform your work, definitely.
Thank you. I just had a further question for Kjell. I could ask a lot of questions about research methods, but I might have to just check out your book on that subject. But I was wondering about your interviews with perpetrators. At what point are you normally able to connect with those individuals or access them, I guess you could say? Like, is it normally following a criminal conviction, or while there's a trial pending, or sometimes when there's no criminal charge? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, it varies from case to case. I mean, it's usually people after conviction. It's usually people I'm talking to in jail. So I've spent a lot of time in jail, obviously talking to perpetrators. And there are all kinds of considerations that come with that. There are all kinds of pressures that come with that. I mean, it's a big discussion, but I would never do an interview with a guard sitting in the room with me, for example. That's just not something I would do, because people wouldn't be comfortable with that. My subjects tend to be anonymous, at least in terms of the dissemination of my results. Of course, if you're interviewing somebody in a prison, people know that you've interviewed the prisoner. I mean, that's really impossible to keep secret. So in some cases, I do that. In many cases, I do that. So in Rwanda, you know, there are hundreds of thousands of people in jail for genocide, or there have been. So there are many prisoners there. You know, prisoners tend to be quite bored, to be perfectly frank. So of course we go through a process of informed consent, as we always would, but it's actually very rare that I have somebody who just says, I don't want to talk to you at all. I mean, what's more common, of course, is that people try to present themselves in their best light. I do the same thing. I probably did the same thing today, so that's more of a human tendency. So the genocidaires want me to think that they're a good person, and so they might tell me stories about positive things they've done in their life, beyond obviously some very negative things that many of them have done. But then of course there are cases where nobody's in jail, or almost nobody's in jail, and that becomes a lot more complicated. Then I have to go find people, and obviously there are different forms of jeopardy involved in that, and I have to consider other consequences of me identifying a perpetrator. But in many cases there aren't, actually. In many cases, I'll give you the example of Cambodia. I mean, Cambodia, you only have about I think about 5 people who've been prosecuted for crimes relating to the Cambodian genocide. So in that case, I mean, I sort of work through networks of people who know perpetrators. I might go to areas where, you know, I would go to An Lon Veng, for example, in the north, where the Khmer Rouge was based for many years, even after the genocide. And I kind of start asking around. That's relatively safe to do in Cambodia. On the other hand, doing that in Bosnia is not so safe, because in Bosnia, a lot of the guys and women, most of the guys, who are not in jail are involved in organized crime. And then that becomes dicey in different sorts of ways, as you could imagine. So it's something you have to assess on a case-by-case basis. But I've been doing it for a while, I guess. But it's tricky, of course. Thank you for the question.
Thank you, Jackie, for asking that. I was going to ask that question, so I'm glad you did. Any other questions in the room? No one online either. I think this is actually a good time to stop. It's 3:30. We have the room until 4, so if you want to mingle a little bit more, you still have time to do so. There's still refreshments. I see things left, so please feel free to stay around. And I would like to thank all presenters. I think this was great. I learned a lot of new things, even from Curt, and I'm in the same faculty. But yeah, it's fantastic to listen to you all, and I enjoyed listening to the questions as well. So one more round of applause for the presenters. And thank you very much. And I'm just going to announce when the next session is. That's actually at the Benedictine campus, and that's on Tuesday, February 27th. So I hope to see you there again, either in person or hybrid. So thank you again for being here today, and have a good evening. Bye.